This is Con Carne. I'm James Van Osdol, and Con Carne is presented by Alex Ross Art. Alex Ross is an all-time favorite of mine, and he's probably a favorite of yours if you've ever picked up a comic book or a graphic novel. I was just watching on Max that three-part documentary series on the history of DC Comics. Of course, Alex's artwork is all over it. The stuff he's done has, no joke, revolutionized the way we read and appreciate graphic novels. Alex Ross Art is the place to go to purchase originals from Alex Ross, or just kind of nerd out and click your way through and see all the cool stuff. alexrossart.com. Con Carne is also sponsored by 90 Days in the 90s, written by Andy Fry. It is a book. It is a throwback. It is a trip back in time to the 1990s, a time that some of us remember fondly. Some of us don't remember, and some of us may not have lived through. But the point is, Darby, who is a record store owner in Chicago in the 1990s, gets to go back in time and relive the 90s here in Chicago. Think about all the cool shows. Think about all the cool moments and pop culture from that era. Darby lives through it, and you could live through Darby vicariously. 90 Days in the 90s is the book. You can get it on Amazon. And also, my friends at Loud Pizza Records in Highland Park carry the book too. You can get it anywhere, but the point is you should read it. 90 Days in the 90s, written by Andy Fry. So Too Much Joy had a moment back when college rock was a thing, back when alternative music had a pretty understandable identity. The East Coast band had pop smarts and funny, quirky lyrics that set them apart from their contemporaries at the time. And now they're back, kind of, in a limited way. They're returning to the Chicago area for the first time in decades, I think. We'll confirm decades, for a show at the Blue Island Beer Company. It's happening on September 16th. Sally Timms and John Langford of the Mekons are also performing that night. We'll get into the significance of that. But here we go. It's Con Carne with Too Much Joy. Buy them beers, your friends for life. It is Too Much Joy. We will see them on September 16th at Blue Island Beer Company, 13357 Old Western Avenue. That's old with an E. It is Too Much Joy. Also on the bill, Sally Timms and John Langford of the Mekons. And I have joining me from Too Much Joy, I have Tommy and I have Tim. And the first important question goes to Tommy. Is that a zebra t-shirt you're wearing?
Yes, it is. Very good.
As in who's behind the door?
Yes, they're one of my favorite bands. They're like how Tim loves the Mekons, and Mekons were one of those bands that were probably never where they should have been. And to me,
Agreed.
Zebra is one of those bands also. I love them. And I just saw them recently where they did that first album front to back, and it was great. One of my favorite albums of all time, their debut album.
Now, as a zebra enthusiast, here we go off the rails. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that first album completely unavailable on digital? I remember looking for it within the past year or two because I wanted to hear who's behind the door, and I couldn't find it.
It should be. No, it should be available digital.
Sure.
I would think. Yeah. I mean, I have the album. I have it on my antiquated iPod, but they were great too. I saw them. I think it was last year, and it was like I think the 40th anniversary. It was like 83. I think their debut album came out, but I'm surprised. A fellow Zebra fan. That's a good thing.
Well, what is it with why are metal bands always named after animals? They're zebras.
They're not a metal band.
They're just a hard rock band.
Yeah, hard rock band.
Hard rock is better.
Lions, snakes, zebras, leopards. You tell me. You're the fan.
Well, the Beatles. I mean, come on. You could decide.
No, but that's just a shitty British pun because they spell it B-E-A-T.
Well, Too Much Joy sounds absolutely nothing like Zebra. And I was thinking before you guys jumped on the call, has it really been since 1997 since we last saw you in Chicago?
96, I think, was the last Chicago gig, actually.
Empty Bottle?
Yes, I believe that was it.
Yes, yeah.
Well, okay. So what's new since then? That's a lifetime ago.
It's our children's lifetime ago. We now go on the road with our kids, with our adult children.
That's amazing. You never really broke up.
No, I said at the time. I think I did an interview with the Onions AV Club at some point in the late '90s, early aughts, and they said something like, "Oh, well, when you guys broke up," I said, "We never broke up. We just, you know, we may never play another show, we may never make another record, but we're not broken up. We just slowed down, which I think is more respectable than, you know, pulling a Who and saying like, oh, this is our last tour. Oh, this is our last tour. Oh, this is our last tour.
Was it just a situation where you're like, you know what, the music industry sucks, we're just gonna cool it for a bit?
Not exactly. It was a situation that we had no more label, and well, I will give you my personal version, and then Tommy can give his. So for me, I my wife, I met my wife. She worked at Alias Records, the indie label that put out our second album, and they were based in San Francisco at the time. And so we met there. We fell in love. She moved to New York because that's where the band was based. But our plan was always to move back to the Bay Area. And so pretty much every year from like 1989 to 1996, I was, you know, she'd say, when are we moving back to California? And I'd say, well, you know, this time next year, the band will either have broken through or broken up. And at that point, we can do whatever we want. And in 1996, I finally realized neither of those two things were ever going to happen. So I said, you know what, let's just move, you know, instead of like building our lives around the band, we'll move and the band can, you know, whatever happens, the band can be affected by what we do with our lives. And Jay made a similar move. So we were just spread out geographically, and we had no label. And, you know, I think it's, you know, and we weren't necessarily writing a ton of songs. So I think it's good to only put out records when you have something to say. And the way of saying them is actually good. And I obviously any band thinks whatever they just recorded is great, but I really do think the last two records we made, you know, having a 25-year pause between records is a good thing artistically. Because if we'd been putting out records in the aughts and teens, they might have sucked. And I think our last two records are pretty much the best fucking things we've ever done.
Yeah, and so that was a hard reset. That amount of time was a hard reset. Yes. And before we continue, you know, I've already complimented Tommy's t-shirt. For those who are just listening to the audio version of the podcast, credit to Tim, who has an Iron Man action figure over his right shoulder and a Clockwork Orange poster. I feel like we could all be friends. So, Tommy, does that story kind of match your memories of the hard reset of Too Much Joy?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was, it kind of sucked at the end. Things was kindly slowly fading, not in a necessarily a bad way, but like Tim said, geographically, everyone, not everyone, but like Tim and Jay went to the West Coast. We ended up on the East Coast, meaning me and Bill at the time. And we actually, you know, we stopped playing, but we never quit one another or made it a final goodbye, like Tim said. So, you know, in 2007, we actually did reunite and did a sold out show in New York for kind of like we called it our 20 fucking year show. We were 20 years together. And then also for my retirement in the NYPD. And so it was, and we kind of realized that we had so much fun doing that and everything. And then fast forward was like 15 years, I guess, ahead of that. And you know, then COVID hit, which was horrible, but it also, with technology and everything, we became creative and started sending each other bits and pieces of songs. And next thing you know, we ended up writing two albums, the last two albums, which I think are great. Like Tim said, I really thought they were amazing albums, and it kind of brought us all together, not only, you know, on a music level, personal level. Again, we got to hang out again. I've been going back and forth to LA a couple of times to see Jay and Tim, and it's just everything's great. That's why we kind of are where we are now. But yeah, so we never quit. We're not, like Tim said, we're not like Kiss doing their, you know, I think they started doing farewell tours in the 90s. So we're not, we never
I think we're on farewell tour 12 now for them.
Yeah, exactly.
And we, you know, and we didn't, well, we hadn't put out any records between 96 and 2021. We hadn't stopped recording. We'd get together, you know, to hang out and just be buddies. And it's natural for us to do that in a recording studio. So, you know, we'd like bang out an old song, or we do, you know, a cover tune for some record store day, you know, tribute album or stuff. And that was fun, but it was really mostly just a way of hanging out. It's not like the tunes we were writing at the time were like, oh my God, the world must hear these. Whereas the last two records, I felt like, oh my God, the world must hear these.
Yeah, I agree.
So my first exposure to the band, I think, was probably a lot of people's first exposures if they're of a certain age. And for me, it was making fun of bums. And I've got to wonder, could a label, not that labels even really exist in the modern day, but could a label release that as a single in the present? I would say probably not.
I don't know. I'm not a big fan of the, oh, you couldn't make that movie or record that song today argument. I mean, you can do anything you want. It's just a question of what will the reaction be. And while it was a snotty title, the chorus is, it's a bad karma thing to do. Basically, it's not encouraging you to make fun of moms. It's basically saying, hey, even, upper middle class kids can be temporarily unhoused. And it sucks when you have no wall to hang your Clash poster on.
That's exactly right. And in the modern day, we're very aware of housing insecurity. Like, that's, people are actually talking about it for real. Son of Sam I Am, that album, it seems like Clowns is as viable today as it was back then. The message there, it stands.
As does the song the lyrics to the song Worse, from the same record. I like to think Too Much Joy's targets are timeless, which is sad, because you'd think if we fling our arrows at them, the world will wake up and say, hey, we can all be better human beings and live more cooperatively.
Just to stay on that album for two more songs, Seasons in the Sun, I think we can all agree that the bass on your version made that song infinitely better.
Oh,
Well, also I will say we did what I considered an artistic reclamation project, in that we restored Rod McEwen's original third verse, which Terry Jacks had bowdlerized. So in the Terry Jacks version, which everybody is most familiar with, it's just this sappy song about a guy who's dying and saying goodbye to his friend and his wife. And in the original Rod McEwen version, which was a translation, a very free and loose translation of a Jacques Brel song. So the original was called Le Moribund, and it was in French. And in both the French version and Rod McEwen's version, it's much more cynical. And the dying narrator is basically, he's singing to Emile his friend, and Francois, his wife. But he's pissed at them because they've had an affair. And basically what he says at the end of the song is, just be careful, I'll be there, because I'm going to be haunting you from the afterlife because you guys betrayed me.
That's much better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for my personal taste, yeah, it's way more compelling. But there's a reason Terry Jacks sold 14 million copies of that song, and nobody knows the Jacques Brel or Rod McEwen versions, because cynicism doesn't really sell. A lesson that Too Much Joy perhaps should have learned earlier in her career.
All right. So if I was a Mekon, I mentioned at the onset of this interview, Blue Island Beer Company. It is the return of Too Much Joy after a decades-long absence in the Chicago area. Blue Island Beer Company, Saturday, September 16th, 13357. The Southside address has messed me up. 13357 Old Western Avenue. Too Much Joy. Sally Timms and John Langford of the Mekons also performing. The Mekons, you've had a rock crush on this band since the 80s.
Yes.
And it was well documented on If I Was a Mekon.
Yes. I love the band unconditionally. When I lived in New York, and they, in the 80s in particular, they would start and end their American tours there, and they'd play like traditionally 2 shows on each end. So you could see them 4 times every tour if you lived out there, which was great. And I didn't marry my wife because of this, but one of the reasons I recognized my wife was somebody I could love was because she had not only heard of the Mekons, but she loved them as much as I did. So we were clearly compatible. So I had written this lyric, and the band turned it into a great little Too Much Joy rocker. And one day in New York, Jay and I were at some weird industry event at the Palladium, which was had once been a venue where I saw the Ramones and I saw the Clash there. But now it was just this weird 3-floor disco. And so we were there just because there was like an open bar or something. I went to the bathroom and I realized I was peeing next to John Langford. So I'm just staring at him, at his face, I should say, not looking. And he kind of notices there's this weird dude peeing next to him, just staring at him. And so he kind of looks at me, and like raises his eyebrow. And I said, "You're John Langford?" And he goes, "Yeah." And I said, "I love your band so much I wrote a song about it." And he goes, "Well, sing it to me." And I said, "Well, I got to go get the guitar player." So I ran over to where Jay was, dragged him back, John's now outside of the bathroom. And Jake starts going jing 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 jing, basically singing the guitar part. I sing the lyrics. And Langford's so impressed with the song that he goes, the rest of the band has to hear it. And he drags us over to the table where not all the Mekons, but several of the Mekons are sitting. I believe they were with Doug Simmons, who was the music editor of the Village Voice at the time. And he makes us sing it to all of them. Now, we didn't know this, but apparently they were all on ecstasy. So even if our performance was terrible and our song sucked, I think they would have been predisposed to like it. And I don't know if it's because of that moment, but that helped us, that and the fact that we shared a booking agent helped us get on the tour opening for them when they were touring on Rock and Roll. So we got to see them basically every night on that tour, except for the San Francisco show, which they flew. We ended with them in New Orleans, and they flew from New Orleans to San Francisco, and we couldn't quite afford that. So we got, so we became friendly with them, and that friendship has continued. But the first night of the tour, I remember it very well. It was at the QE2 in Albany, New York. Walked into the venue to sound check, and Sally was sitting at the bar, and I introduced myself, and she goes, "Oh, you're Tim. I hear you want to sleep with me." Now, if I was, a more composed person, the proper response to that, which I realized the next day, of course, should have been, "Well, doesn't everybody?" But instead, all I could think of to say in a moment was, "Or John."
Oh, or John.
Yes.
Perfect. Nailed it.
I tell you,
amazing.
just to add to that, by the way, I never heard of the Mekons, and Tim kind of introduced Sandy and I don't know, Tim, how familiar Sandy was with them, but I'll never forget when we started the tour with them, and I thought rock and roll. Tim introduced us to that album, and being on tour with them, and the album is like one of my favorite albums now. But I remember every night we would the four of us would get in front of the stage, and they would play Heaven and Back, and there's I've been to heaven and back, I've been to heaven, and we'd all kick like the Rockettes in unison. It was like really cool, but it was such a fun tour to do with them. It was great. They're great. I'm excited to see them also in Chicago. It's gonna be cool.
And I think we can all agree that Memphis, Egypt is just one of those fantastic Mekon songs that should have been much more influential than it was. I mean, influenced you.
Absolutely.
That album for sure, but that song.
Yeah, I'm realizing now I've peed next to John Langford many times before.
Lucky bragger.
Well, yes, because I remember now seeing them at the I-Beam in San Francisco, before Rock and Roll came out, but they Memphis, Egypt, and Blow Your Tuneless Trumpet were already in the set. So they were playing new, if you're a Mekons fanatic and you're at a Mekons gig and you hear a new Mekons song, it's very, very exciting. So I was really looking forward to that album when it came out. And because I was a dude in a band, and I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy of the cassette. And when I actually went to Italy to be on a trip with the woman who's now my wife, that woman from the record company I fell in love with. We went as friends. We came home as something more than that. And we met in Milan because she was already over there. And we got on a train to go to Venice. And I said, I have a surprise for you. And I took out my little Walkman, which had my advanced copy of the Mekons Rock and Roll in it. I put the little foamy Walkman headphones over her ears. And she got to listen to that album on the ride from Milan to Venice, which sort of started our trip off magically, and I think set me up for success when I finally hit on.
Now, you mentioned that Too Much Joy never sold 14 million records like Terry Jacks. Serial Killers was the one that could have. That was the one that seemed poised to at least head in that direction. Good Kill is just it sounds fresh to me.
Thanks.
All these years later. I mean, I know you're most proud of what you've done most recently, but some of those songs on Serial Killers, man, they still hold up.
Well, so, the thing about Serial Killers is it was our major label debut. And while we weren't quite the savvy businessmen that we presumed we were, reading every bit of our major label contract and proposing suggestions to our lawyers who just laughed at us and said, none of this matters. It's like, if either you have a hit and you renegotiate all this shit later, or you don't and you have no power, you're powerless at the moment. You can't really change anything on here. It's like, here's what you can change. we were smart enough to know that we would probably never get another chance like this again. So while a lot of bands would take a major label advance and live off of it, and then make another $15,000 records like the ones we made for the indie label, we literally spent every dime and more of the recording budget on the record so that we could get the sounds we were hearing in our heads out into the world, for what might be the first time ever. So we were, when we first signed to Warner Brothers, basically what happens is they have like a list of producers, and you have lunch or dinner with a bunch of them, and you discuss, their philosophy and approach to recording, and you figure out who you want to work with.
It's like speed dating.
Yeah, it was very much like that. And like I'd say the first half dozen people we met were all just like, oh, you're a punk rock band. We're just gonna like put you in a room, set up some mics, and record you live. And none of those people got the gig because we're like, we know what we sound like live, and it doesn't sound good. It's wonderful if you're there, because it's an experience, but it's not something you want to listen to after the fact necessarily. So we went with Paul Fox, who just most recently had done Oranges and Lemons, the XTC record, because we wanted to make, we wanted to spend every dime of that major label recording budget making our big, not necessarily, I don't want to say commercial, but we wanted it to sound like a fucking pop record, like the music we love. So we were constantly suggesting things that the producer was like, I don't know, that's a little too slick. We're like, put the fucking trumpet on there.
How did the KRS-One cameo or appearance come about? Were you friends? Were you in the right place at the right time? Like,
so that was mostly through Sandy, the bass player, and more specifically his wife, Layla Turkan, was our publicist at the time, and she was basically the hip hop publicist. So she was LL Cool J's publicist. She was Public Enemy's publicist. She knew everybody in that space. And so when we had wacky ideas, like, we covered LL Cool J's That's a Lie, and we were like, oh, it'd be great to get him in the video. She's like, I'll call him up and ask. And he said yes. And so then when we were recording Serial Killers, and, we're upper middle class white suburban kids. We love hip hop. So as only Yale graduates can. And so we were, and of all the people in the early days of hip hop, I would say probably, KRS-One was easily the band favorite. I think he was certainly mine lyrically. And so we had the notion of working with him in some capacity. And as we were, we wanted to do it on Serial Killers, and, Layla had reached out to him and he was open to it. And so we were thinking about what to have him on. And since Good Kill is a bit of a message song, anti-death penalty, we knew he'd probably be into that. And so we just sent him a DAT, which is what you did back in the early 90s.
Sure.
With the music on one channel, and he laid his bit down on the other channel and sent it back to us. And then, Paul Fox, the producer, mixed it, comes out. Next time we run into him, Sandy runs into him and is like, oh yeah, how do you like the song? He goes, oh, it's really interesting. I would have put my vocal on the beat.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, that stung a little bit.
He was expecting an R.E.M type experience out of you.
Oh, so this is the story of Too Much Joy's fucking life, right? We recorded that because Warner was still working the re-release of Son of Sam I Am, which had originally come out on an indie, and they re-released it with a couple extra tracks. And it was doing really well. So they put us on the road, and we had completed Serial Killers, but it took almost a year for it to come out after we'd finished recording it, because we were still promoting Son of Sam I Am. So even though we had KRS-One rap on our, college rock indie bands record a year earlier, when our record finally comes out, it literally comes out the same day as an R.E.M album that also has KRS-One rapping on it, literally the same day. So there's a line on the next album, I'm ahead of my time, but only by a week, that's referring specifically to events like this that keep happening to us. But I will say, again, not to be a cocky, Ian McCulloch asshole, but we use KRS-One way fucking to better effect than R.E.M did. On R.E.M song, he just goes, hey, hey, hey. On ours, he actually fucking raps, in line with the song, and singing, espousing a similar message. So if you're going to have a fucking hip hop star on your song, make him have some words.
And here we are in 2023. I don't see R.E.M coming to Blue Island. I see too much joy, and here we are.
There you go.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, with KRS-One, I'll tell you a quick story. I probably because I guess serial killers came out in 91, Tim, right? 91. Yeah. So about 8 or 9 years ago, after that, I was I'm still a cop in the Bronx, and they had what they call a Bronx Walk of Fame on the Grand Concourse, which around 161st Street, 100 to 158th Street, and all along the Bronx concourse around where Yankee Stadium is. So I wanted to go there at the time because Ace Frehley was getting inducted into the Bronx Walk of Fame, and my son was only like 7, 8 years old. I wanted to bring him there, but KRS-One was also getting inducted into the Bronx Walk of Fame. So to make a long story short, I went there, and this was probably when Ace Frehley was in his drug-addled days, which he probably may still be now. But I'll never forget, they had all these weirdos going to it dressed as Ace Frehley, overweight people, and he was eating a hot dog, and there was mustard like coming off his face. This is Ace Frehley, and my son was like, "Dad, is that really him?" But anyway, the KRS-One ended up being at the ceremony also. So I went up to myself, and I'm in uniform because I was working, and said, "Hey man, thanks again for playing on our album." And he's like, with all those people and everything, and he just looked at me like no idea who the hell I was, and wanted no association probably with this uniform cop claiming that he was on his album. So, but it was pretty funny.
Well, what people who are just listening missed was the near spit take that Tim just did when you told that story. Tim almost spit out his entire beverage as you shared that story. I don't know which part I love more, the encounter with KRS-One or Ace Frehley covered in mustard. Like, never meet your heroes, kids.
He was eating a hot dog, and his handler was like, it was like dripping down his face onto his, and his handler's like trying to wipe it away from him. It was like a hot dog vendor on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. And I just remember my son looking at me going, "Dad, is that really him?" I was like, "Oh man, this is bad."
I see, but still, that's a level of fame to attain, to have a handler to wipe your mouth
Yeah,
for you.
how about it? That's the New York groove right there.
Yeah.
So, all right, where does 2023 find us? So you're coming to Blue Island. Again, the show is September 16th at Blue Island Beer Company. Sally Timms and John Langford also performing that night. It's your first time here in Chicago in decades. I mean, obviously, this can't be, you're scattered across the country. This can't necessarily be a full-time concern the way it was in the 1990s, say. But where does this leave us? Is this kind of like Brigadoon? You'll just appear every 100 years, or is this going to soldier on?
I don't know. I think we're sort of like, one of those locusts or crickets that, hibernate for 17 years.
You're like a cicada.
Yeah.
You're the cicada band.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so we emerge when we have something to say, and then we go back underground and hibernate for a while and then reemerge. But we're in our, we're in the phase where the skies are just full of too much joy cicadas at the moment. And I don't know how long this cycle will last, but we're at the stage where it at least pays for itself. So it doesn't, it's not putting any money in anybody's pocket, but it's not costing us anything, and it's bringing us a lot of joy. So as long as we can, we can't, it's not like we can do a 3-month tour of the entire country. But any place we can get to without losing money, we will go to and play. And this is one of them.
I love it. Well, I'm glad you're coming back to the area. Again, if people missed you in 1996 at the Empty Bottle, now's the time to catch up with Too Much Joy. I'm so glad we had the chance to talk. And please drive carefully on your way out.
We will. We will. Our roadies will, while we lay in the back and yell at them.
And as established, those are family members?
Well, no, I mean, actually, Tommy's son will be joining us in the van, but the van will be driven by a tour manager we worked with in the 90s named Jody Lorenzo. Just a great guy with like a rockabilly haircut, idolizes Dean Martin. So in the olden days, we had a van that had I mean, it wasn't ours, we rented it, but we'd rent the vans that had like a little TV with a like little VHS player inside of it. And so he'd bring all his Matt Helm VHS tapes. And all his Dean Martin, roast VHS tapes. And he'd just teach us the ways of Dean Martin on tour. So we're excited to be working with him again.
No pressure. We just learned today that Taylor Swift paid all of her crew members 100 grand at the end of the tour. So I mean,
Oh,
I saw it was like a total. It was like $50 million of bonuses spread out amongst everybody. And well, I will say, in an effort to have this tour not lose money, I quoted Joe a really low rate, and I was like, "Look, this is what I can. This is what I know I can afford." But we're like a communist collective. If there's any profits at the end, we split them. So this might not be all you make, but it might be. If we lose money, the band loses money. You still get paid, but if we make money, you get more. So that's the deal we cut with everything.
it's a good plan, comrade.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and you're going to the Blue Island Beer Company. I mean, you can pay them in beer. Just make sure they're not driving out of there.
Exactly.
True.
All right, guys, what a pleasure to meet you. Again, the 16th of September, it is Too Much Joy at Blue Island Beer Company. Glad to have you back in town.
Thanks so much. Thanks for helping promote the show.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you.